Dr. Korten, welcome to Politics Done Right. It is my honor to have you on my show.
Thank you. It is truly a delight to be here with you. I sense we have a great deal in common in terms of our thoughts about the world and our common future.
Absolutely so. But let me first ask this question. I want to get this out of the way because, you perplex me. I see a title like professor that you got your MBA and PhD from Stanford Business School that you taught at Harvard Business School. And then I have to ask this question. What happened?
Oh, it may be a longer story than we have time for here. But, I grew up in a place called Longview, Washington. It's a
Hmm.
small town. It was very middle class, working class. I thought I was going to come back and run the family business. I had very little contact with any other part of the world. It was basically an all white community. I sometimes say the most exotic person in my life was my aunt, who was Catholic and had red hair. Um, Little could I imagine that when I was in an undergraduate at Stanford and a very conservative young Republican, I took a course in modern revolution. And I learned that the revolutions that were threatening our American way of life around the world were a result of frustrations with poverty. So I thought, well, we figured out how to solve that here in the United States. So I'll go ahead and go to business school, which I was planning to do anyway. But instead of going back to run the family business, I will spend my life taking the secrets of U.S. business success to the rest of the world. So that was kind of the start of my shift in career. And so I was involved in setting up business schools around the world for a time in Ethiopia and Central America and then in Asia. But the deeper we got into it, the more I realized that what was happening as the frames of what we call capitalism, raw
Right.
capitalism, were actually destroying people's lives. If you actually saw what was happening to them, they were also destroying the earth. And I began to realize there's something really wrong here. And so that led me into this latter part of my life, which has all been trying to understand, why is this going so terribly wrong? Why is it so contrary to the basic story that I grew up with? And how do we get out of it? And as we've gone further and further with that, we now realize that we are on a collective path to self-extinction if we continue the damage we're doing both to the earth and to each other. And so this is our moment of truth. We either turn it around or we go away and creation finds some other experiment.
Right. Well, look, as the most powerful country in the world, we have a lot of gravity. What we do is either mimic around the world, or we can influence a whole lot that happens around the world. But we have to be able to change from within before we can change from without. You wrote a piece, and the piece that actually got me in touch with you, and I subsequently got interested in the other piece, which was why I have hope in the face of human extinction. But before that, the piece that I read that you wrote was leading the charge at Yes Magazine, called "Confronting the Great American Myth." One of the things that I've always said is that one of the reasons we have a hard time changing the rest of the world is really into some sort of Medicare for all. We're resistant to that change because of there's something exceptional we think that there is about Americans, and I tied that directly to much of what the fallacies of much of the genesis of America. So why don't you tell us a little bit about this article that you wrote, why you wrote it, and tell us a little bit about what's in the article, because I think it'll put some it would set quite a few people right.
Yeah. Well, basically, of course, we're all taught, and some of us are more inclined to believe it than others. But we're taught that America was founded by these visionary founding fathers who were dedicated to creating a new democratic nation, um, which implies that it's a it, it's a government that actually works for all of the people and everyone has an equal voice. We knew there were a few irregularities in that, but we kind of suppressed that. At least those of us that grow up in more conventional white communities. It's also true that at the time I was growing up, America was much more of a middle class society. So again, that wasn't necessarily true across racial lines, but within the white community and places like where I lived, there was not much contrary data on that. So it's very easy to believe that founding story, but it doesn't take a lot of research to realize that America was basically founded on land that was stolen from the Native Americans who lived here, and much of that land was worked by slaves stolen from Africa and imported here under horrendous conditions against their will. Even in the North, where there may not have been conventional slavery, a lot of the work was done by indentured servants who indentured themselves to get their passage out of what they considered to be even worse circumstances in Europe. So you put this together and then you realize, well, pretty much all those founding fathers were people that had big estates. They had big tracts of that stolen land. A great many of them were slave owners. Some of them seemed to feel a little uncomfortable with that, but the fact is they were still slave owners. And as you begin to realize what was in the Constitution and how the thing started out, you realize that the way the Constitution was written, it protected the rights of property. It gave the vote only, not only just to white males, but only to white males who also were owners of property.
Property, yes.
So even the vast majority of white males were excluded. And, in a sense, if you're a man, your odds of being better off than a woman are pretty good. If you're white rather than black, that's pretty good too. But it's not really defining. The defining part is that it had very little to do with the democracy, and the way the Constitution was written, it secured what we call plutocracy, which is government by the rich or rule by the rich. And what I come to realize is that we'll never have real democracy until we realize that we have never had it.
That is so that state, not to interrupt you too long here, but that I think is a very important statement, because many folks on the right would have you believe that what we're doing is moving away from some glorious past that we had that was good to many. I mean, a lot of folks, whenever I make certain statements, they would say, well, that is not constitutional. And I was just speaking to somebody in Starbucks a few hours ago, and the guy said, well, how do you explain that it's not constitutional and that is something you support? I said, look at me. Why would I have a reverence to a constitution that actually considered me 3/5 of a person as a compromise to get a nation formed?
Yeah. Exactly. I mean, the truth is so simple. It is, I have yet to come across anybody that doesn't, at some level, realize that our land was stolen by force, and that we had slaves, most of whom were black and imported from Africa. So you really don't need much more data than that. And then you realize that the Constitution pretty much enshrined all of that. And the other thing, which is sort of less well documented, and I don't claim to be a U.S. historian. I'm much more concerned about the contemporary economics. But as I have come to understand it, the founding fathers were not the ones that organized and started the revolution. They jumped in after the revolution was already started, basically aware that they were going to get swept aside if they didn't jump in and assume leadership of it. And of course, by assuming leadership of it, they also put themselves in the position of of then ruling after it was over and writing the rules of the new nation and all of that. Now, somewhere embedded on all that is a vision of of a better world, which is more equal in its rights and more equal in the spread of property. But that is in a sense better reflected in the Declaration of Independence, which was intended to kind of mobilize everybody, than it is in the actual Constitution, particularly the original Constitution without the Bill of Rights. But then even with the Bill of Rights, as we know, it's taken a very, very long time to, first of all, even get voting rights for white men that didn't have property, and then eventually for women, and then eventually for blacks. And we're still in a way, well, not in a way. I mean, we're still working on that, and we still got a long ways to go.
Well, I can tell you right here in Texas, I mean, this week, the governor of Texas has sent voter rolls that he wants cleaned right here in Houston. Our Houston mayor is saying, is telling the registrar here in Harris County, do not clean the voting rolls. So you're absolutely right about that.
Yeah, I mean, this HR1 that the Democrats are trying to put through, and obviously will not get through until we clean out the Senate and the presidency, is just one of the most simple, basic steps in actually trying to solidify basic voter democracy. But of course, the deeper issue is that even if everyone has a secure vote, as long as big money controls the media and our information and the campaigns of the politicians, so there's basically no way that you can win a majority unless you have the support of the nation's billionaires. You're not going to have real democracy, and that's kind of the other foundational issue, that political democracy absolutely rests on economic democracy. They are inseparable. Because also, if you don't have political democracy, the rules will be framed so that they support and sustain extreme economic inequality.
I think you should explain that a little bit more, because that is really profound. You need economic democracy in order to really have political democracy.
Yeah, I mean, you think of when a person's running a political campaign, it takes a lot of money, particularly because of the control of our media by big wealth. So, these are things that I can remember from my childhood too. We used to have a fairness doctrine in the media. If you were on the radio using public airways, you had to use them for the public benefit, which, right, among other things, meant you have to give equal time to different political candidates and political parties. So, but now they've found, wow, we can control that, and some of the biggest profits of the for-profit media companies, that, including those that use our public airways, is selling political advertising. So to get the political advertising, you need people who can afford to make big contributions. And that's where, of course, our Citizens United and the Supreme Court and so forth, again, another move. This is also, I mean, the Supreme Court is actually part of the whole scam. When the nation was founded, to give the power they gave to the Supreme Court, we know pretty well that anybody's going to end up on the Supreme Court, given the rules, is going to be a white male member of the plutocracy. I mean, how else do you get to law school in those days? So, in a sense, the Supreme Court, as it was set up, you could say it was to secure the intention of the founders, but not the democratic intention of the founders.
Well, it couldn't really be democratic when ultimately every law when they have the power to determine if every single law is constitutional. In fact, many believe that one of the reasons that the Republicans know that their party is about to go on to extinction, and one of the things that they needed to do was pack the courts, because the court is one undemocratic institution where, in the case of the Supreme Court, ultimately 9 men will determine if any law passed in Congress is constitutional or not. And they
Yeah,
have the right to say anything is
yeah,
unconstitutional. So there's no democracy there.
absolutely no democracy there. And again, go back to the beginning, and it was pretty clear when they wrote that into the Constitution that they knew pretty well that that court was going to be controlled by white male property owners. Period. So,
Exactly.
ultimate veto power.
Ultimate veto power. Now, I don't know if your book, the book The Post-Corporate World, because there's some other issues that I'd like to step on where it comes to the corporation before we jump into that other subject, and that is with the personhood, the corporate personhood, and how that has evolved over time to give corporations preeminent power.
Yeah, well, this of course is especially fascinating, and there's actually a new book coming out by my publisher. I just wrote the foreword to it, called "When Wealth Rules the World,"
Hmm.
which in a way is, I think, more accurate than "When Corporations Rule the World."
Right.
But you think about the corporation, a very interesting institution. And actually, in the early days of the United States, corporations were very strictly controlled.
Short-lived.
Short-lived. For a specific period, you were chartered for a specific period of time to do a specific task, like build a particular railroad or
Right.
a canal or whatever, and it had to be in the public interest. And then you went away.
Yes.
Um, Now, but think of the way the thing is framed now. You're a rich person. You'd like to have a whole lot more rights and power. So if you form a corporation, you form a corporation with limited liability. You form a corporation that has no limitations on its right to control property. Now, this is why economic democracy is so foundationally important. What is the thing that we absolutely most need to live? We absolutely need clean
Water, our
water.
food, clothing, and where to stay, property.
Yeah, it all rests on the land.
Exactly.
I mean, this was one of the things in my work in international development that it suddenly broke through my consciousness. The people we were trying to develop were people who lived off of the land. Now, by the economist frame of reference, those people were living in absolute poverty because they had no money.
Right.
But they had fairly decent houses, many of them. They had fairly secure supplies of food. They had clean water. They had communities. They had their children and culture. And some of them actually had quite good lives, far better lives than most people do in our society. But they had absolutely no money. So then you begin to define money or well-being totally in terms of money. And that justifies your going in and forcing these people off their land into paid jobs and into a world, which increasingly ours has become, which we've probably all noticed that in this world in which we now live, if you don't have money, you are indeed absolutely poor in the sense that you have no access to food. Increasingly, you have no access to water. You are homeless. And in some places now, some places in China, the air is so bad you got to buy bottled air if you want to breathe.
Yes.
I mean, that's in a sense
I'm
that's the
I am
capitalist
glad you
ideal.
I am glad you brought that up because I mean on some of the commentary here, I have two of my biggest conservatives supporters here who are probably the largest capitalists out there, and one of the things they don't understand, they want lower taxes on oil companies. They want lower taxes, but they have not. They refuse to see the externalities. They refuse to see that. Well, how much of the price of that gas is going back into the economy to fix all the damages that it's created, the cancers that it's created, the defects that it's created. They don't understand that we are living in a closed loop, and that the reality is if the prices of gas and what the oil companies don't pay in taxes, etc., is not recovered, it means that they are getting welfare, much more so
Oh
than
yeah,
the standard welfare people would talk about.
and what
You can expand on that.
yeah, and of course what they're doing with that is using it to, well, there's two things. One, they're just speculating to create money out of nothing, out of nothing, out of nothing, to have more control. But the really important part is that it gives them control of more and more of the world's productive lands and
Right.
waters, and of all the things that we absolutely depend on to live. Now, let me give you a little secret here. If you want to control the world, the thing you want to focus on is controlling access to the things on which people absolutely depend to live.
Yes.
Now,
It,
if you can set it up so everything they depend on depends on money, oh, that's a great diversion because they become focused on the money rather than on you. And if you could also fix the system so that you control the creation and access to money, wow, you've got it.
Now,
You've
before
got it.
for those people that are just joining us, I want to tell you we're speaking to Dr. David Korten. He's a co-founder of Yes Magazine and also president of Living Economies Forum. For those who are for conservatives, my great conservatives that are listening, who sometimes take issue with some of the subjects, rest assured that Dr. David Korten was a professor at Harvard and also got
Harvard Business School.
Harvard Business School, and as well got his degrees at Stanford Business School as well. So I mean, we're not talking about some left winger. We're talking about somebody who knows all aspects of the economic system, who has come to several conclusions. One that we are going to discuss a little bit further, where it comes to the Earth in general and the extinction of humans. But continue, sir.
Yeah, well, let me actually say a little bit to the conservatives. Um, in a way, there's a piece of the philosophy I've come to that remains deeply conservative. Um, Now, conservative has, well, like many of our terms, it has different definitions.
Right.
So, the classical conservative was a believer in monarchy.
Right.
So, they were against the American Revolution because they wanted to conserve the monarchy. Um, Now, actually, many modern conservatives, when I said I grew up very conservative, um, the conservative that I understood was about local control. It was about local ownership. It was about local economies, local small business. And I think one of the reasons that we had the outcome that we did in the last presidential election was a lot of people didn't trust Hillary
Right.
because they thought she was aligned with the big corporate Wall Street interests. I must admit to being one among them. I didn't vote for Trump, but it made me a whole lot less enthusiastic about her than I
Right.
otherwise would have been. Now, where a lot of contemporary conservatives, in my view, get a little confused is that they are only concerned about the oppression that comes from big government.
Right.
They are completely separated from the oppression that comes from the concentrations of economic wealth in
Wow.
big corporations. And in my view, if you're to be a true conservative within this local control frame, um, you basically have to be equally against concentrations of big government and concentrations of big business. Now, I've also become very aware in my world travels, some of the most delightful places to visit and have political discussions and so forth are the Scandinavian countries.
Right.
People call them socialist. Well, you could call them capitalist also. They got lots of private enterprise and they've got some of the same problems. Some of them are too big and so forth. But the other thing that I realized in those visits, um, I sometimes gave presentations in places like Norway or Sweden. And, in my presentation, in the auditorium, you'd have the heads of all the political parties all sitting there talking to each other. We're having the same kind of conversation and basically finding common ground and differences and so forth. But, we're all neighbors. We live together. We go to parties together and so forth. And we all ultimately live with the same outcomes, with the same community. But these are small countries. So, big government in Finland or in Norway or Sweden, would be more the size of kind of a medium-sized state here in the United States. That's very different. Um, so it, it actually works a lot better if you've got somewhat smaller units and more decentralized control. You still, particularly in our interconnected world, we absolutely need um, organization at the national and global level. But we need a whole different organizational frame, not the top down imperial
Right.
force. Here's what you got to do at the local level, but rather what we call subsidiarity.
Exactly, and there are trade-offs, I imagine, and that is there that you need the national things for what I like to think about. Well, what do Americans stand for? And that's all you need the national group for. In other words, there are certain things we don't allow in this country that are absolute. I like to look at it sort of the the big federal government is a bill of rights, and everything else happens on you can do as you please otherwise. The bill of rights are the things that's absolute, and everything else should be
Yeah,
done at the local level. I think even my conservative friends here agree with that part.
yeah. Well, this it's interesting. This is the conversation that we need to have because I think there's a basis for a whole lot more conversation between conservatives and progressives. Uh, I mean, this is another thing to understand about plutocracy or about empire, and this goes back 5,000 years. Um, if you want to maintain power at the top and concentrate power so you can oppress all those people at the bottom, you have absolutely got to keep the people at the bottom divided against each other.
Amen. Exactly.
So, very convenient. Do that on the basis of race, do it on the basis of gender, do it on the basis of religion. Man, I don't care how you do it. Just make sure that they're fighting each other rather than looking up and fighting
See,
you.
I mean, like I said, it is amazing. It is amazing that those are quite a few things that we talk a lot about on politics done right, and it's great hearing that from someone who is in a different world. You're traveling all over the world, and you see how these things have manifested themselves throughout Africa, Asia, South America, Central America, etc. That is great. Okay, let's move on because I think you've been very diligent in what we've said so far, but I want to get to your second piece. But before we get to your second piece, I want to read something from the prologue to your. I don't know if it's a prologue to your book, but and I want people to understand these three sentences here because I was I got a new level of impression. It said as follows: for your book, The Post-Corporate World. Capitalism is a pathology that commonly afflicts market economies in the absence of vigilant public oversight. I could not have said that any better. Número dos, second one. Since the economy internal to a corporation is a planned economy, and people don't like to hear that. People always talk about these other economies being planned. You hit it on the nail. Since the economy internal to a corporation is a planned economy, the current consolidation of economic control under a handful of global corporations is a victory for central planning, not the market economy. Sir, when I read that, I said to myself, I've spoken a whole lot about capitalism versus democratic socialism, etc. That sentence really is what conservatives should really be keying on. That one that you and before you answer any of that, though, I want to read the last one. The alternative to the new global capitalism is a global system of healthy market economies that function as extensions of local economic systems to meet the needs of people and communities. And that kind of drives right into your next subject as far as us sustaining humanity, not the extinction of humanity, if you will. So the floor is yours.
Well, you have covered that very well. Let me add in an additional piece, which is
Okay.
absolutely foundational to the theme that is really central to my work currently, which is the human transition to what some call an ecological civilization. And that is the part about this this shocking extreme claim. We humans are living beings born of and nurtured by a living earth. Now, isn't that wildly, outrageously extreme? Who would ever?
Not really.
I, of course, laugh about it because
You should, yeah.
it is the most foundational of truths that anyone that is not totally mentally deranged immediately gets. We're living beings. Yeah. Okay, living beings have certain kinds of needs. If we get further into living beings, we also know that they have ways in which they have to organize to create and maintain the conditions essential to their own existence. Now, when I was, the deeper story behind my book, The Post-Corporate World, was that I wrote it actually in response to a meeting with a very slight woman from China, of Chinese descent, who approached me one time at a conference and said, "I'm Dr. Mei-Wan Ho." She says, "I'm a microbiologist and I've read your writing and I think you might be interested in what I'm doing." But she explained to me, ended up long conversations. So the conventional biologist will take a living cell, grind it up, study its chemical composition, and then think they have learned something about life. She said, "I study living cells and how they manage internally and manage the constant exchange of nutrients, water, energy, and information." Now, here's a shocking thing that we don't think about, but it's so obvious. Each of our individual bodies is made up of tens of trillions of individual decision-making cells. Wow, this is fascinating.
And they so work together.
And they so work together, and if they didn't, we would not exist, but all of that goes on totally outside our consciousness. And the thing that she really broke into my consciousness, at that time, I thought, well, it's all controlled from the brain by the nervous system, so it's all a hierarchical system. And there's some of that, but most of the control is absolute self-organization as they're constantly engaged in these exchanges of information and energy, water, and nutrients. And we have only the slightest understanding of how that all works. But we do know for certain, if it didn't work, we wouldn't be here.
We absolutely would not be here. So we don't have much time, and I want to cover this other great piece that you wrote, Why I Have Hope in the Face of Human Extinction. So why do you have hope? in the face of human extinction.
Yeah, because if we understand the big picture of where we're at, and this is a thing that I've begun to realize. It's not totally new, but I sense it quite literally within the last few months, almost since mid-November. There's just a very rapidly spreading awareness that we are absolutely destroying Earth's capacity to sustain life. And we absolutely depend on that capacity. So we are, as a species, in our collective choices, not our individual preferences, but what we actually do, we are destroying the foundations of our own existence. We're basically destroying Earth's capacity and all the species on Earth to maintain this process of self-organization that makes this planet distinctive among all the planets of the universe
That we know of, yeah.
that we know of. Chances are there may be others, but
Mm-hmm.
we haven't discovered one yet.
Right.
So we best assume that we have an extraordinary responsibility for this one. But it's also a matter of getting straight that, if we value ourselves at all, we have to make some very fundamental changes very quickly, and we have to do it together with a deep sense of our common interest. And if we don't, we are likely to expire. And if we are as unique as it appears we are, that's not only a crime against humanity, that is a crime against creation.
And you know what? Even conservatives who tend not to want more involvement should look at that, because there's a part of for those that are Christians, there's a part of the Bible that makes humans the stewards of the earth. Isn't that right?
Yes,
For those that
exactly.
are, I love how you broke it into 5 points. One is earth balance, equitable distribution, life-serving technologies, live-in communities. Four of them, live-in communities.
Yeah,
And you went and broke down each one of those quite well. I haven't posted this one yet to the blog, but I'll make sure to post this one to the blog as well.
good, good. Yeah, I mean, again, it comes back. It is also foundational in a way so straightforward. Now, can we change? Um, again, what are called the neoliberal economists, the
Mm-hmm.
theoreticians um, that put forward a philosophy or an ideology that they claim to be science, but it's actually
Mm-hmm.
it's kind of an uh, evil sect morality. Um, if we follow that, that's the path to our self-destruction. But if we're going to move away from that, it requires very deep change, as you indicated, of just about everything, and almost instantly. Now, could we do that? This is also part of this experience of having grown up in one isolated culture, totally unaware of the world, to an adulthood. And my experience is not so unique because it's fairly common within my generation that we grew up in this kind of isolation, but we were also then at a point where the world was opening up. And so we had opportunities to experience varied cultures and varied peoples in ways that very few of our ancestors had ever had even the remote possibility of doing. And if you do that, and if you're paying attention, you realize that different cultures have very different stories and very different ways of interpreting. At the same time, if you go deeper and deeper, you also realize that most all people, in many senses, we are absolutely the same.
Exactly.
Absolutely the same. We have the same needs,
Same
uh,
wants,
the
same
same
everything.
wants, and the same possibilities,
L-
including the fact that part of what makes us distinctively human is that we live by our stories, which is essentially we live by our beliefs. And when we grow up in cultural isolation, we grow up within our culture's set of beliefs. So those are reality, those are truth, and we don't question it. In some ways, that's a handicap. In other ways, it's absolutely essential to our ability to live together. If we're not operating from shared assumptions, it's very hard to coordinate our activities with one another. So we develop different cultures in which we organize in different ways. But if you step back and you realize how that works, you realize instead of saying, well, it's our nature to be competitive and violent and evil, or even that it's our nature to be loving and kind and generous. I think the latter one is closer to the truth, but the reality that we deal with is that we have the possibilities of being either one.
You know, go ahead and finish with.
Well, so it becomes a choice.
And
And this is the choice that we now have to make if we're going to have a future, because there's only one, there's only a set of beliefs that recognizes we are one. We are with Earth. We survive and prosper together, or we perish together.
That is an excellent way to close it. I want to say one specific thing, because and you touched on it, and I think it bears making that a strong statement. First of all, yes, I do have hope in that we can make a difference. I wouldn't be doing this if I didn't think that were possible. You wouldn't be doing all those wonderful things that you're doing if you didn't think it was possible. The people that we're meeting, the people I'm sure we see the difference. But here's the thing. I don't know if you remember the Wall Street movie. Greed is good, and all that sort of thing. The reality is, they always talk about greed is what makes things happen. The reality is most Americans really, they want a lot, but they're not greedy. And most people want a lot, but they're not greedy. The truth of the matter is, if folks were more greedy, if folks were like these pseudo-capitalists out there that really want to take it all, really want to be fully extractive, we would be in a continuum of war. And the fact that we're not proves that. The fact that 80% of Americans just let bygones be bygones just prove that humanity isn't that humanity that most capitalists would like us to believe it is.
Well, if their belief were true, actually, we wouldn't even be here. We would have self-exterminated a long time ago.
Dr. David Korten, co-founder of Yes Magazine, president of Living Economists Forum. Thank you so kindly for having been on Politics Done Right. We will definitely have you again.
Thank you very much. I look forward to it.